First of all, thank you all very much for coming. It's great to see people supporting independent bookshops, because as you know, Bookmarks is one of the relatively few left, along with Houseman's and in London and even in the country, that haven't been squeezed out by the corporate giants, and mainly by Amazon, of course, which can, what do you call it, economies of scale we can't compete with. So it's very important that people take it on consciously and come to independent bookstores and buy books from us. And we have also have a very good online service. So if you order books, we can't get you quite as quickly as Amazon can, but we can get you there in a reasonable time. So thank you for that. Tonight we have Bernard Regan, who's going to speak on his book on the Balfour Declaration. I've known Bernard for some time. I used to be a teacher and a member of the National Union of Teachers, and Bernard was on the executive, actually before my teaching time, or perhaps just towards the beginning of. He's been very important in raising the question of Palestine in the trade union movement, and working with lots of other people in the unions to get it on the agenda, first of all, when it was quite difficult in the beginning, and to move forward the policy and get part of many unions' policy. So I'm not going to go on about it. Can tell you the story, but this is, of course, the anniversary of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and it was in the self-same year, of course, that the Balfour Declaration took place. So there's many linkages and many tie-ups here with struggles, against colonialism, against imperialism, and for rights. So thank you, Ben. Going to speak about 30 minutes, yes?
Yeah. Debating whether to stand or to sit, but probably more polite to stand, and then you can hear me. First of all, it's always a good idea to ingratiate yourself with your host, so nevertheless it's heartfelt to say thank you very much to Bookmarks for inviting me. I do regard Bookmarks as a real beacon in terms of bookshops in London for having access to socialist and trade union and labour movement struggle and literature about that. So I really do appreciate the role that Bookmarks has played over some decades now. So I do consider it an honour to be invited, and thank you very much to Dave for doing that. I'm also conscious in the audience that there are old comrade friends that I've known for many years, and I'm probably my sharpest critic, so I shall have to be on my best behaviour in terms of getting the message across about what I want to say. So forgive me if I kind of wander on occasions. And the other thing, by way of an apology, is that I've got a series of slides which I normally show with this presentation, just to so that the audience can have something to look at when they get bored and they've got something to divert them, But unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to employ that trick this evening. So I hope you're going to give me some latitude and be able to follow through. The starting point, in a way, for looking at the whole question of Balfour for me was a sort of research that I did some years ago. And it really began from what I thought was very largely a kind of myth that is presented about Balfour. And in fact, several myths which are interlinked, but which are kind of critical to the way in which it's presented, particularly in Britain. And one of those is the notion that Britain was somehow being altruistic towards Jews who were fleeing persecution in Europe, and for that reason they were, if you like, sensitive to or supportive of or responsive to the notion of Zionism and the idea of creating a homeland for the Jews. And I don't think that actually was the case. I don't believe, for one stretch of the imagination, that British imperialism has really ever been benevolent in its actions. It's rather more has been centred on doing what it wants to achieve. There's an interesting quote in a book by Niall Ferguson, who's not a particularly kind of progressive historian, but he summed up, and I must read it to you because I think it's kind of quite apt and a very good summation of the role of the British. He says that this is how the British Empire came to be formed. He says they had robbed the Spaniards, copied the Dutch, beaten the French and plundered the Indians. From the reign of Elizabeth I, there had been a sustained campaign to take over the empires of others. And I think that's a very good way of summarising the history of the British Empire and British imperialism. And the point about Balfour, I think, one of the critical points about it, is that it took place in the context of the First World War. And that war, as I'm sure you're familiar, was a war between various imperial rivals, which really had begun from the 19th century with the race for the scramble for Africa, as it's often called, where competing imperial powers, particularly France and Germany and Britain, were seeking to establish colonies on the African continent. And of course, at the conference at Berlin in 1882, they literally sat down and divided up how they thought they were going to distribute these various kind of colonies for the future. And what happened, particularly at the end of the 19th century, and then came forcefully to the fore with the First World War, was that this rivalry exploded into the World War that took place. And what I want to say about the Balfour Declaration and what happened in Palestine is that this was very much a part of that process. It was not that somehow Palestine was distinct and there were things that were unique. There were things that were unique about it and specific to it. But in general, the whole issue of Palestine, I think, has to be seen in the context of those imperial developments that were taking place and the ambitions that Britain had. Britain at that time controlling more than a quarter of the landmass of the world, more than a quarter of the world's population. And I think that, you know, when we try to envisage what that was very much like, you might say, America at the present point in time, in terms of the dominance that British imperialism had across the globe, its reach, its power, its capacity. And in order to function as an empire, and in order to keep all of these kind of components articulated and actually to have strings that attached them together or brought them together, it was very critical for the British that they were able to dominate the Near East, the Middle East, the Arab world in particular, because it was part of that. And I think there are three critical reasons, and these reasons were talked about in the British War Cabinet, they were discussed, and they were part of the whole discussion. And they were the following. The first, and they seem obvious, and I think people can look at them and say, yes, of course that's the case. But I think what is critical is not just these issues in isolation, but their combination in this particular moment and in this particular part of the world. And they were the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal was important because, as far as the British were concerned, they had to have a way of ensuring they could guarantee communication between the imperial homeland of Britain and the rest of the empire. And that meant for them in particular, the area which was kind of the prize as they saw it within this was India. Australia, New Zealand further on, but the critical area was India, which was a resource of mass wealth plundered by the British, as you know, not only stealing the wealth of India, but actually ruling it in a way in which de-developed India and ensured that India could not develop its own economy as imperialism does. It's not just a question of plunder, it's also a question of the way in which it deforms the development of the economies and the politics of the countries which it occupies. And so the Suez Canal was a critical part of that. More than 50% of the world's shipping was British, not just European, but of the whole. So British fleet's access to the Suez Canal was important at this point in time. And it was important because of that trade with India, but also, if you look at the map and you were able to envisage it, right the way down the east of the African continent, almost all of that land area was under British control, right the way from Egypt in the north through down to South Africa, with one or two exceptions. There were German colonies at one stage, and there were some other areas, but by and large, that whole area. So in order to be able to maintain contact with them, the Suez Canal was important for both those kind of geographical features. In addition to that, the British were concerned because at this point in time, although they were in alliance with us, and as the First World War developed, they were in alliance with the French, with the Russian, Tsarist Russia, they were anxious about the ambitions of their erstwhile allies. So as far as Russia was concerned, for example, Russia wanted to gain access to the Indian Ocean because it wanted to have access to ports that were ice-free the whole year round, as opposed to dependent on the ports in the Baltic and in the White Sea and areas like that, which for large parts of the year, or certainly in the winter months, are rendered unusable as far as kind of fleets are concerned. And their anxiety about the Russians was that the Russians were trying to insinuate their way through Afghanistan and towards the Indian Ocean. And Afghanistan has remained right up until this day, of course, a matter of contention, and Russia was involved, through the 80s and the 70s and the 80s in Afghanistan. So that was an area of concern. And being able to have a fleet that could go from Britain through the Mediterranean, through the Red Sea, into the Indian Ocean and to India was vital as far as Britain was concerned, in order to get military reserves to India in the event that they were confronted by Russian incursions and Russia seeking to expand its interest into that area, and so on. But so anxious were they that they also were concerned that they had control over the land bridge between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, because they wanted to try to develop a railway connection between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf as a way of being able to get those troops and those reserves to India more swiftly than if they went through the Suez Canal and they went through the Red Sea. And this is not my kind of imposition of these kind of notions. This was actually embodied in documents that were presented to the cabinet about the way in which Britain should develop its policies in the post-war situation. And in the event of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, what would it be that they were looking to do? And Lord Kitchener, whose image I'm sure is in everybody's mind, the man who, pointing the finger, saying your country needs you, or perhaps not everybody remembers that image, but a very vivid image in terms of kind of, British war historiography. He actually presented a paper called Alexandretta to Mesopotamia, which was about, as the name suggests, the linkage between the port of Alexandretta in the Eastern Mediterranean and across to what we now call Iraq, Mesopotamia, with a view to building a railway line, and also to ensure that they could keep the line of communication. And one idea, and this in a sense ties in with what we're talking about when we come to look at Palestine and the colonisation that took place there with Zionism. One of the ideas that Kitchener projected was that perhaps they create colonies in the Mediterranean, in Mesopotamia, around Basra, drawing on Muslim community in India to actually establish a kind of enclave that would be a kind of British colony, if you like, but albeit colonised by people, other non-British people, but by members of the British Empire, or people drawn from the British Empire. And that was part of a concern, and this wasn't just Kitchener, it was other papers that were presented by the government, to make sure that they had that, as I say, that kind of land bridge in order to be able to get troops to the Indian country of India. And at this time we're talking, of course, about Bangladesh and Pakistan and India all as one, not as the separate entities they now are. And in doing that, they would be able to get those troops across that distance 2 weeks more quickly than if they went by the sea route. So it was a strategic, viewed in from a military perspective, as a strategically important access and facility to be able to utilise. So these are some of the considerations then. It's about the Suez Canal, it's about the role of the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf and the land bridge of the Near East, the Arab East, across that area, in terms of British Empire being able to ensure it could achieve what it wished. But on top of that, at this time, and becoming increasingly more important, was actually the development of oil as a resource. And this wasn't, people often, when we talk about the Middle East, people often say, oh, it's about oil and so on, and of course it is. But I think what is not appreciated It's just quite how early this became an issue, and just how much it was kind of in the minds of the British Empire and the cabinet and people talking about what they wanted, what they call their desiderata, what they wanted after the end of the war from the Ottoman Empire when it was broken up. And both Kitchener and a man called Maurice de Bunsen, who was charged with drawing up suggestions about what should happen, identified oil as a critical thing that they wanted to have control over. And they wanted to do that because they didn't want to be dependent on the United States. At this point in time, the USA was the major producer of oil for export. Oil was produced in places like Baku and Caspian and the southern part of Russia. But they were concerned to make sure that they actually were able to have access to, and more importantly, control over oil resources in the Near East. And they talked quite explicitly about this. In the war, oil became incredibly important because of the development of militarized, mechanized warfare, the expansion of tanks, the use of armed military vehicles, the use of airplanes, which became something that developed. And between, not just because of that, but for other commercial reasons, between 1900 and 1920, the import of oil in Britain increased 11-fold. So it was absolutely astronomical development of oil as a commodity that they were keen to control. And with some foresight, you might say, in 1912, Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, recommended to the British cabinet, and they agreed, that they would convert the whole of the Royal Navy, the military fleet of the British Empire, that they would convert it from coal-fired to being oil-fired. And in doing that, what they did was they increased the range of those vessels by something like 50%, and they also transformed the crewing of those vessels, so that instead of having lots of people on the ship who had to shovel coal and stoke the fires and make sure that the engines were working and so on, they could reduce that by 50%, and obviously, conversely, they could increase the fighting capacity of those who were crewing the vessels. So these were big changes, and that took place as early as 1912. And you can see, therefore, it links into this thing about why and how oil became important. So I think these things are not, just, they're not, I don't think that they're kind of minor references. I think they are defining references in terms of how the British Empire saw this area. It was something that was seen as being vital to being able to maintain their control and their links with the other areas of the empire throughout this point in time. So what of the people in the area? Because I think often the history that's talked about in relation to Balfour kind of focus on what people like Balfour, David Lloyd George and people like this were thinking. But actually, and on the one hand and on the other hand, tends to focus on what Zionism was, how it emerged, who the people were involved in that, what they were seeking and so on. And I think very often in the course of that, people completely ignore what was the wishes of the Arab peoples of the region, what were their aspirations, what were they seeking to achieve. And it was very clear, it was something that was not just emerged in response to the British occupation of Palestine and the Near East in 1917, but it was something that preceded that. There had been there was a long gestation, if you like, of aspiration for national independence, which went on through the end of the 19th century, through the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century. And in particular, the wish and aspiration for the peoples of the Arab world for national independence, for independence from the Ottoman Empire. And in the course of discussions with the British, of course, there was a discussion about how the quid pro quo for they supporting the British against the Ottomans would result in this independence as a consequence of that alliance that they struck. But in fact, of course, something quite different happened. The whole development of critique of Zionism, by the way, as far as the Palestinians were concerned and as far as the Arab world was concerned, didn't just kind of emerge in 1917 or after that. Well before that, in the 1880s, there had been demonstrations in Palestine against colonization taking place. In the early part of the 20th century, there were newspapers produced Arabic newspapers, both in Palestine and in the neighbouring regions, in Cairo, in Damascus, in Beirut, and so on, which critiqued what Zionism was about and what they envisaged would happen as a consequence if Zionism was successful in establishing a Jewish homeland. And there was something like 11 or 12 newspapers circulating with articles explaining this. And many of these articles were, they weren't syndicated, but papers that were published in Beirut would draw on articles that were written in Cairo or were written in Damascus and so on and so forth, and they would exchange those. And it's interesting, just as an anecdote, jumping a bit further forward, that there is this kind of view that maybe the Arab world and Palestine was not particularly literate, and there is this image presented, particularly by pro-Zionists, that it was a very, perhaps underdeveloped in many kinds of ways. And although literacy was on the lower end of the spectrum, if you like, what happened was that people would gather in cafes and would be read newspaper articles and critiques, and also people would actually, in sort of workplaces, they would have breaks where people read the news. I mean, something that happened in other parts of the world as well. I mean, in Cuba, in the tobacco factories, they had somebody reading stories, and they read Victor Hugo, and they read the newspapers, and so on and so forth. So the idea that people weren't interested, I think, is quite wrong. I mean, there's an interesting quote by a man called Haycroft, who was a British military figure, who, when he was examining the situation of some riots that took place in Palestine in the 1920s, made the comment that actually that in a small Muslim town there was immense political discussion, and people were much more political than in the equivalent British town of the same sort of size. They were more interested in politics, more engaged with politics, and more knowledgeable about politics. So I think there is a kind of very false image. I mean, that goes without talking about the economic development, the cultural development, the political development that had taken place and was taking place in Palestine. So the British entered into discussions with the leadership of the Arab world, or then leadership of the Arab world, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, to draw up an agreement about what this quid pro quo would be. And it's I'm not able to show you, but the map, essentially, if you can envisage it, would be a line drawn across what is now the Turkey-Syria border, down the, what we now call Iran-Persia, down the Iran-Iraq border, all the way around the Arabian Peninsula, with a little exception of Aden, back up the Red Sea and straight to the Mediterranean. In other words, this was a protocol drawn up in 1915 by the leadership of the Arab national movements, which was saying quite clearly that all of that region would become independent as a result of supporting the British in the fight against the Ottomans. And that was, clearly expressed in the letters that were written by Sharif Hussein of Mecca to Sir Henry McMahon, which was part of the discussions and the negotiations. British Empire, however, true to form, was not only carrying on discussions with the Arab leaderships, but was simultaneously carrying on, or almost simultaneously, just a slight shift in time, carrying on discussions with the French. And that was resulted in negotiations which took place between Francois-Georges Picot and Sir Mark Sykes, and resulted in the famous Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a decision essentially to carve up the Middle East between the French and the British. And almost, if you look at the map, and unfortunately I can't display it to you, but if you look at the map in its original form, it has straight lines in it, which is a typical giveaway of an imperialist, drawing of boundaries, because across the whole of Africa you see these straight lines being drawn that have no relationship to any geography or demography or social or political kind of characteristics. And they divided up, essentially, very crudely speaking, Syria and Lebanon to the north would be under French influence, and everything below that, Jordan, Mesopotamia, would be under British influence. And Palestine was slightly aside because they couldn't agree. The French wanted to have control over Palestine as much as the British. And the British, as I said earlier, even their allies they were suspicious of, and their anxiety was that the French would use this advantage to actually move towards Egypt and reassert control over the Suez Canal, and therefore cause problems to them. So this was a sort of, action that the British were taking. On the one hand, having discussions saying, yes, this is what we will grant to the Arab allies in the consequence of the fight against the Ottomans. On the other hand, saying to the French, no, we will divide this up how we wish to see it. And that was very stark. But it's interesting that when they did this, and if you look at the original maps, the northern part, which the French presumed would be their region, and the British part, the area of Palestine is indicated in a different colour, because what they were talking about at one stage, and this was partly to assuage the French and not create any kind of agitation on their part, was that it would be an international condominium that would be under international control. It would be accessible for the great faiths for whom Jerusalem and other parts of Palestine were holy, so Jews, Muslims and Christians would have access to it. And that was how they presented it, that they were not going to be specific about it, and they would actually have some kind of reciprocity, some kind of accommodation between them in order to deal with how they would go forward. Jumping forward, in relation to the situation in Palestine itself, the proportion of Palestinian Christians and Muslims was about 85% of the population, somewhere in excess of 500,000, the population in 1914, very crudely, with a population of something like 47,000 Jews. And those Jews were overwhelmingly Mizrahi Jews, or Jews from the Arab world, for whom Arabic was their language, their culture. They were part of that community. They were not distinct. And indeed, right until the end of the 20s, they were actually quite alienated by the Ashkenazi, by the Eastern European Jews who came in as colonizers into Palestine, and had, on a number of occasions, speakers from the Palestinian, the embryonic Palestinian national movement, going to their synagogues talking about opposition to Zionism, and actually were engaged in a discussion. It didn't develop profoundly because there were a small number of people, but there was an element of recognition on both sides. And when the Palestinian congresses met, for example, in Syria and Damascus after the British occupation of 1970, they very clearly asserted that those people who lived in the country, i.e. the Jews who were there, would be part of that nation, and they were always understood as being part of that community. So I suspect my time is, how are we for time?
You got 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Right. I'll make a rapid jump then. The point being, however, that the Palestinians had a perception and an idea of what they wished to achieve in terms of independence, of self-governance, of seeking to create a national identity. This whole notions which I know we would very readily and immediately dismiss, our land without people for a people without land. This kind of rubbish, is just kind of not worth spending a moment over, except to say that it's not just about Zionism. That was what imperialism said at every point in its history. I mean, people like Locke and Hobbes, the so-called great British philosophers, said this many, many times in the past. So it was just, a trope, an expression that was kind of regurgitated in order to kind of justify this whole thing. Zionism itself was not entirely homogenous. It grew out of the pogroms and the horrendous attacks that were taking place in Eastern Europe and in Russia in particular. Massacres that took place at Kishinev and Odessa, where I think somewhere in the region of 2,500 Jews were killed. more than 2 million Jews fled from that whole region, particularly to the United States, in the course of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But when Zionism was formed, it came out of, if you like, a growing development of nationalist politics. And in some senses, I don't think that's surprising, because if you look at the 19th century, it wasn't until the second half of the 19th century that countries like Italy and Germany were finally kind of unified. And even in Spain, you had the Carlist Wars that were taking place. In Eastern Europe, you had the formation of countries like Bulgaria. So the idea of a nationalist solution, in a sense, fitted in with some of that kind of thinking that was there. But it wasn't entirely unified, because first of all, within the Jewish community as a whole, Zionism was a very much a minority point of view. It wasn't a majority point of view. It wasn't even itself homogeneous in how it perceived the creation of a homeland for the Jews. There were different currents within it. And, for example, when they came to talk to the British about it, they actually were willing to accept land anywhere in the world where they felt they could create territory that would be under their auspices, and that they would not be, they would not be beholden. So, for example, right in the beginning of the 20th century, 1903, David Lloyd George, who was then a young member of Parliament, wrote a charter which was not unlike the East India Charter, which was giving a license to Zionism to have land in East Africa, which would be part of that homeland. And it was a serious discussion about actually accepting that. And until 1905, for the first, almost the first decade, but perhaps about 8 years, the first 8 years of Zionism, those views, which were known as territorialists, of being willing to accept land anywhere in the world in which a haven could be established, was actually the majority view within Zionism itself. And it wasn't the case that people saw without equivocation that Palestine would be their goal. And when this issue, and I'm jumping forward now about a decade, when this issue became discussed in the First World War, it was because of Britain wanting to, as I said, to have a footfall on the area of the Near East. And when it came into discussion into the cabinet, it was vehemently opposed, in particular, by Sir Edwin Montagu, who was the only Jewish member of the British cabinet, who said that the danger of this is that what will happen is that you will see an increase in anti-Semitism, because what will happen in those countries across the world is that they will turn around and say, now Jews have somewhere to go, that is where they should go. And that what would take place as a consequence is that they would be stripped of their own nationality in the countries in which they lived. So British Jews or German Jews or French Jews or whatever would cease to be British, French, German, and that they would face as a consequence increased anti-Semitism. Montagu was extremely hard against that. And in fact, it wasn't until just before the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917 that that view became that view that there should be Palestine should be the homeland for the Jews actually became a majority point of view within Judaism in Britain. It was very, very late, and it was very much tied in with the fact, in my view, that what was going on was that Zionism, as it had done from the very beginning, had been looking for an imperial patron to ensure it could achieve its gains, because it knew it would not be able to do that alone. So Herzl, the founder of Zionism, for example, had gone to speak to the Kaiser, went to speak to the president in France, went to speak to the Italian Prime Minister, and very interestingly went to speak to von Plehve, the Tsarist minister in the Tsarist government, who was an extreme anti-Semite and was behind and associated with the Black Hundreds and those who had been carrying out the pogroms that I was talking about. They did that. Herzl did that because he knew that he needed an imperial patron in order to ensure that he could achieve what he did. But the fact of the matter, of course, is that that tragedy continues today. And it's interesting that Harry Thatcher, who was one of the leaders of British Zionism, warned that the danger will be that in achieving our goal, we may start to act in the same way that the Poles acted towards we Jews in Eastern Europe in the future, unless we deal with this issue. So even people who were supportive of the whole notion recognised the difficulties that came in. And of course, there's the whole history of the way in which in the 20s in particular, Britain took measures that were not only political measures in denying the rights of the Palestinians, but very profound economic measures whose consequence was that the Palestinian economy was unable to develop. Just 4 years ago, in 2013, the World Bank produced a report on the economy of the West Bank and said that were it the case that the Dead Sea chemicals, which has nothing to do with cosmetics, is to do with bromine and potash, which are major agricultural chemicals that are used in producing crops and so on, that if it had access to that, it would have transformed the economy of the West Bank absolutely colossally. And the British, by deliberately giving the monopoly of those resources to pro-Zionist entrepreneurs, excluded the Palestinians from actually having access to that to develop and grow the economy. And similarly, the same thing happened with electricity, that the privilege was given, the monopoly was given to pro-Zionist entrepreneurs who then were in a position to exploit it. And what was happening, whilst that was happening, was that as a consequence of the growth of the settlements and the colonisation which was taking place, which was largely as a result of big landowners in the Lebanon selling land inside Palestine, dispossessed farmers and peasants were unable to get work inside Palestine in these areas of economic development because the policy adopted by the Zionists was that Jewish employers should not employ non-Jewish workers, and so that exclusion took place as a result. So Balfour's consequence, if you like, continues to reverberate to this day in terms of the way in which that development of Palestinian society has been dislocated, in my view, as a result of all of those things. I better stop, I think.
Thank you. We've got time now for questions and so on. I thought perhaps we